KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, as well as affiliated this year with the University of North Carolina Center for Information Technology and Public Life, as well as the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. Today, I'm excited to have back on the show a repeat guest, Duke University's David Schanzer, who was last on the show talking about cyber and security issues, but today is discussing a topic which, as we were recording on May 15th, 2024, is very current, which is the issue of on-campus, protests by students, primarily against the actions taken by Israel in the Israel-Gaza war. David wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago now, April 27, 2024, which caught my eye, titled "Universities Must Tolerate Anti-Israel Protests, but Regulate Them to Protect Jewish Students." The subtitle being, "Doing so will require an adept balancing of the competing interests at stake the university has failed to execute to date." David writes in a Substack that he is titled Perilous Times, which I read and which I highly recommend that people subscribe to. But what David wrote about here is threading a needle, which in my estimation has not been threaded well by most commentators, frankly, and speaking personally, by most universities, which is how to balance the competing interests of speech and safety, not to mention viewpoint censorship, that is occurring across the board. What David writes here, and we're going to get into it, is that the answers that most universities, although there may be a couple that have done this well, I'll ask David about that, but that most universities have responded to the protest, again, recording in mid-May, of either trying to shut them down or perhaps overreacting, is a problem. And it's a problem because the reactions can quash speech. And so we get into, and we will get into, what speech means in this context. At the same time, David's piece acknowledges that violence, right, and threatening violence and blocking people from accessing classrooms and so forth is not the kind of protected speech that universities should be tolerating. And so how you balance these interests, how you balance these concerns, is what we're going to be talking about here. David lays out, after and meticulously researching, by the way, which is another reason why it caught my attention, very well hyperlinked for the nerds out there, so you can go directly to sources. But what he proposes, and we're going to get into it, is, in one sense, very, I think, common sense, and another hand, again, not seen all that much. First, strictly punishing acts of violence and threats of violence, and we'll talk about what those threats look like. Using time, place, and manner policies to protect Jewish students from harassment and ensure a smooth functioning university. And again, in this context, because it is Jewish students that have been threatened, not exclusively, but certainly heavily in these protests. And that universities should enforce the protest regulation policies using tools like student suspensions, but avoiding the police to break up protests. And through that, lastly, be patient and wait the students out, which is a very real, right, a very real and practical way to handle it, right, because schools are winding down, exams are happening, and so forth. Do not punish students, lastly, for using anti-Semitic rhetoric during sanctioned protests. Now, to state the obvious, right, David and I are both Jewish, Levine and Schanzer. If you needed to look that up, you can very quickly. Levine's an easy one. Schanzer, you might have to look a little bit more, but then you'll find it. But notice what we're talking about here, right? It is about how to protect speech, even speech that he or both of us may not agree with. And so we're going to get into that as well. He lastly suggests don't cancel graduation, which of course we've seen graduations canceled, and probably more in the coming days. So before I get into it, very quick introduction. David is a professor of practice at Duke Stanford School of Public Policy and the director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security. He was the Democratic staff director for the House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security from 2003 to 2005. He was served as legislative director for Senator Gene Carnahan in the early 2000s, and counsel to now President, then Senator Joseph Biden, right, 1996 and 98, and counsel to a very interesting and important person in recent American history, Senator William Cohen, from the mid-90s, 1994 to 1996. Lots of other background, really impressive. And David, thank you for joining us today via Zoom to discuss what I consider to be very important piece.
Well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts with your network.
So David, let's dive right in. I summarized your points, but let's take a 60,000-foot view. We're recording on May 5th, 15, 2024. What's your take on where things stand right now with regard to the protest and how the universities have handled them?
Well, I'd say after some really bad missteps, I have seen some more patient responses. I just got notice as a Harvard alumnus that the encampment in Harvard Yard is being voluntarily broken up. Students who have been suspended will hopefully have a chance to get reinstated, graduate if they're seniors, and so on. There's been some sort of resolution, but this was after an extended time of an encampment, extended hostility between the administration and the protesters, threats of suspension for students because they were creating, according to Harvard, an intolerable situation on campus. So I think we can look at lots of different examples across the country, but I have seen some examples of what I would call a more patient and prudent response than what happened, let's say, with the Columbia.
Yeah, so let's go backwards a little bit to the genesis of writing this piece, and again, the protests are going to continue on campuses, obviously after the war, and the battle in Gaza has ended, and so we can learn a lot from this. So let's backtrack about a month to mid-April. What caused you and what concerned you that gave rise to writing this piece?
Well, there's been the hearings in the House on college anti-Semitism, and we can discuss some of the politicization of that issue if you want. But you had a entire lengthy day-long hearing by the president of Columbia, some of the board members, and a professor who was heading their kind of commission on anti-Semitism. And during, and then the protests have been hot and heavy from the beginning at Columbia, even after the October 7 attack, before Israel even responded militarily. There were large-scale protests against Israel at Columbia. So these have been going on for quite some time. The president of Columbia stated during the hearings many times that their policies, relating to protests were going to be strictly enforced. And the students, essentially while she was testifying or even beforehand, early that morning, started gathering, not just to protest, but to create a Gaza solidarity encampment right in the middle of the university. I think by later that evening, she had issued an order to disperse. And then that afternoon, the following afternoon, the NYPD was authorized, was requested by the university to come in, break up the protest, and arrest the 150 protesters for trespassing. So, that really brought out issues relating to, why they were being arrested, what the limits, were on free speech at an American university that generally prides itself on the exchange of free and open debate and ideas. And that's why I wrote the piece.
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit on the Columbia situation, since it really was the touchstone for it. So those hearings to which you refer, right, were, and you alluded to it, did have a heavy political bent to them, and without getting into the minds of every member, clearly there were political points trying to be scored. And yet what also seemed to come out of it was that the universities were struggling almost to the point, at least to the naked eye, of making one wonder whether these issues and this balancing had even been considered as a policy, or thought about deeply. In other words, one would expect that the presidents of some of the nation's leading universities and the world's, right, would have been able to handle, the political statements and the grandstanding better. And without getting in, I'm not asking you to mind read, but I'm curious what your reaction was at a top level to the seemingly very poor, right, messaging or even discussion of the issues coming from the presidents of universities themselves.
Well, and this goes back, of course, to the famous hearing with the three university presidents as well, and it goes to a matter of preparation. I think Columbia had a message going into the hearings, which was that, listen, we allowed too much direct harassment of Jewish students by the protesters in the early days. We were not ready or equipped to deal with some of these issues. We changed our policies appropriately, and now we're going to enforce them in a way that protects the rights of Jewish students. And there's a big Jewish population in Columbia, including a lot of Israeli citizens at Columbia. And I think that was their message, that we're going to protect the students and we're going to enforce time, place, and manner restrictions on protests and speech. And my feeling is, a university president to allow themselves to be browbeaten by the members of Congress and have words put in their mouth and then get to the point where they were making personnel decisions on live TV instead of standing up for not only free speech, but academic freedom, core values of the university in the course of the hearing was shameful. And if I had been prepping them, and I told them, and these members of Congress aren't even letting you respond and putting words in your mouth as to what you believe or what people on your campus believe, I would insist on the opportunity to fully answer questions and not to be browbeaten like that. But they just kind of timidly sat back and allowed themselves and their university to be pummeled. And I thought that was very unfortunate. And then it seems as if the president felt like she had made such a commitment to strictly enforce the free speech policies that when the students, engaged in what was at that point considered an unauthorized protest, she just quickly jumped to DEFCON 4 and calling the NYPD onto campus for the first time since 1968. And not suspending students or threatening a suspension or something like that, which is certainly in their purview for student discipline issues, but to arrest them for trespassing and so on. So I thought it was a very bad overreaction and very defensive kind of atmospherics for the University of Columbia. And that kind of, it really backfired not only at Columbia, but across, it triggered what started happening across the country, which were still big protests, but nothing like what we saw afterwards.
Right. We're chatting with David Schanzer of Duke University, author of the Substack piece through his newsletter, Perilous Times. Universities must tolerate anti-Israel protests, but regulate them to protect Jewish students. It's interesting to me that the subsequent criticism of those presidents and others has been more or less that they were not only perhaps kowtowing or bending to members of Congress, but they were also, bending to whatever loud voice seemed to be in their ear at that moment. So in other words, we want to try to please everyone, and in the process, you please no one. How much of this do you think ultimately is driven by public perception of the presidents themselves and the universities, as opposed to the kinds of policies to which you refer, and we're going to discuss both academic freedom and freedom of speech?
Well, I think this, kind of, if you want to go back even further, I think it goes back to the issue of, and it's interesting, there's just a lot of ironies embedded in all this. is that a lot of the critique recently of universities is that they've been hostile to free speech and that they haven't allowed a full range of conservative viewpoints on campus, that their faculties are not comprised of very many conservative voices, that the students are being indoctrinated. And I disagree with this critique. Not that there aren't some elements of truth to it, but I disagree with the general critique. Um, uh, and then when some of the speech that starts flowing out of the universities is anti-Semitic speech, the people who were calling for more free speech were calling for speech codes and crackdowns and discipline of students who were exercising free speech rights. And the universities who had been criticized for not providing a real free speech forum started saying, well, the reason we're allowing this speech is because we have a free speech ethos on campus. And so there was a lot of hypocrisies and ironies surrounding this issue right from the get-go. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's, I think, an accurate description of kind of the meta issues that are at play, and not to mention kind of the general critique of higher education in general.
Well, yeah, and that's
By
kind of what I want.
conservatives. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to get on. I mean, the perception of certain voices not being welcome or heard is one issue, which I want to talk about too. But to push it a little bit on this, right? In other words, I don't expect you to mind read, but what's going on here? Well, why is it, in your view, that university presidents so quickly seem to buckle or switch sides? Because the hypocrisy might be obvious depending on one's perception, but it begs the question of why. I mean, in other words, and again, I mean, what do you have a supposition as to how we got to this point that we would see what is a pretty obvious contrast and ultimately lack of willingness to push back on a lot of this stuff?
Well, first of all, I'll point out, I think this has been a hard issue in America, and I think it's been a hard issue for the Supreme Court, frankly, is the idea of hate speech. And when a speech that is, truly hateful, derogatory of either individuals or groups based on immutable characteristics and so on, um, uh, the Supreme Court has said that over and over again that is protected free speech. Now, we have public universities and private universities in America. The public universities are bound by the First Amendment, and so could not punish speech that unless there are exceptions at play, but it cannot generally punish speech even if it is hateful. That means racist speech, homophobic speech, anti-Semitic speech. And that's a hard pill for, both students, faculty, and universities to swallow. Universities are not just like the public square, although they are generally considered that for First Amendment purposes for public universities. They are places of learning. They are students' homes. And the students certainly feel differently about speech that is happening on campus that is directed to them, that is maybe funded by their university in some direct or indirect way, than they feel about, what they might read in a newspaper, or they might hear somebody saying outside the gates of the university. So it is a very hard and difficult issue. And I think there is some hypocrisy here in that many forms of racist or homophobic speech probably have been punished and squeezed out at universities. So there did seem somewhat hypocritical when anti-Semitic speech was occurring, or well, let me get to that second point. Anti-Semitic speech was occurring on campus, and the same kinds of reactions weren't occurring. The other big difficulty here is trying to define what is and what is not anti-Semitic speech. And that's where a lot of the browbeating of the witnesses took place, and they really failed to stand up for themselves. And the range is very broad. Some people feel that almost any criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Many people consider what I would call anti-Zionist or speech that calls into question whether Israel should have ever been created as a state, the whole Zionist project, and so on. They say even questioning those things is anti-Semitic. And we can go on, but I think that is since to try to decide where that line drawing takes place is quite difficult. The Harvard and Penn and MIT presidents tried to say, listen, anything that is conduct related to a student, that would constitute harassment. But the members of Congress did not want to hear that. They wanted to hear that, well, if somebody says something against a Jewish student or an Israeli student, kill the Zionists, that they should be suspended from school. And that's where the debate is. So these are not, simple issues.
Right. And David, your piece gets into this, right? I mean, and you highlight a tension, which I mentioned in the introduction, right? The inherent tension, you write, between providing a campus environment consistent with free speech principles and protecting students from harassment. Lawyers and law professors, but also policymakers love definitions. And so we're about to go in this direction, Hearsay Culture listeners. But you quote the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights as defining harassing content as, quote, verbal acts and name calling, graphic and written statements, other conduct that may be physically threatening, harmful, or humiliating. Now, those kinds of definitions are very useful because what they don't do is force you to define anti-Semitism, right? You can instead say, look, is this, right, name calling? And yes, there are lines that we can draw in terms of whether a particular phrase or moniker is name calling, but we have these definitions as well. And as you point out correctly, the First Amendment also protects what is understood as hate speech. And so it raises a question that you point out that I want to ask you about, which is the growth in recent years on college campuses. It predates these protests of what universities and others have called safe spaces, right? The spaces where people can go and not hear, I'm putting it simply, not hear viewpoints or speech with which they disagree or which might make them feel uncomfortable. And I've always been challenged by safe spaces in a university setting, particularly in university classroom buildings. Now, I train lawyers, and lawyers by definition have to be able to hear and process in order to understand and respond to viewpoints with which they vehemently disagree. Otherwise, you can't be a lawyer. But that's not true of all professions. It's certainly not true of all university spaces. How do the safe spaces, or how does the safe spaces debate, which has been an issue which has been going on for a while, and many universities have implemented, fit into this, in your view, right? The discussion and challenge regarding these most recent protests?
Well, I'm not entirely familiar with how the concept of a safe space has been implemented in all schools. I
Right.
know for a while we had a room where students could feel like they could go to, decompress, where they might be able to meet with the counselor to discuss things that were upsetting them and bothering them about the campus environment, or to address issues relating to identity and so on. Um, but we had never received any sort of dictate that the classroom itself must be a safe space that does not, where controversial or upsetting issues are never discussed. And I don't know, there wouldn't be much left of some of the classes that I teach if that were the case. Now, again, I think a lot of this has been overplayed by critics of higher education who want to portray the university as this, again, highly ideological space where students come in with their certain ideas, and those are only reinforced and never challenged, and don't develop critical thinking skills. Again, I strongly disagree with that. And so they want to make it seem like every classroom was so hypersensitive that you never really, discussed anything of value. And I just don't really think that's ever been the case. I do think, um, especially during and in the years after the pandemic, we have a youth mental health crisis on our campuses. We have a lot of issues relating to identity and sensitivities that are quite valid because there's a lot of hateful things that happen, conduct, speech, and so on. And we want to create an environment, and I want to create an environment in my classroom where every student feels comfortable, feels like they can learn, and feels like they're being respected. And I think you can do that and still discuss controversial topics. But there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do it. And I think it requires a lot of skill sometimes from the professors. So I don't I don't reject the notion of safe space, that we should help provide healthy learning environments for all of our students. So I don't reject in that regard at all, but I do reject it as the idea that, oh, well, we're just going to cleanse the university space of anything that so-called makes somebody feel uncomfortable. And when some people use the term uncomfortable, and then they quickly make the move to not only uncomfortable, but therefore I feel unsafe, like my physical being is being threatened and violated. And I think that kind of move and that kind of language has been, very unhelpful and unproductive. And I will say that that has been deployed by many Jewish students as well. Um, Not all. I think there have been, legitimate concerns and fears that people's safety, actual safety, was being jeopardized. But there also is, I also have the sense that when a lot of Jewish students hear, I hate Zionism, or, even death to Israel, that is necessarily a direct threat by somebody to say, I'm going to harm you. And I don't think that is the case. I think those kinds of statements, I disagree with them fundamentally, but I don't think it should be out of bounds for students and faculty to litigate, 1948 and the creation of Israel. Uh, I think it was the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean my view should predominate. I think we have to have full and historical and ideological debates about that issue. I don't think that should be carved off as being too insensitive, too sensitive to even talk about.
Which brings us to social media, which I want to pick up right after the break here. And I'll note before that break, David, that of course what you just articulated at the end there about free inquiry and discussing these issues is what animated the formation of Hearsay Culture and now the Hearsay Culture Network. You are listening to Hearsay Culture on KZSU-FM Stanford, which has been on the air. I cannot believe I'm saying this at this point, 18 years. 18 years it's been on the air at Stanford since 2006, almost to the day, since we're recording it in mid-May is when I started the show in 2006. KZSU remains nonprofit, non-commercial, and requires donations to continue its diverse programming. So please do email our underwriting team at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu, and you can check out the Hearsay Culture Network and our range of shows, including my new co-host, Denise Howell, who's doing shows with us at hearsayculture.com. So let me come back to you, David, on social media, which is a topic on Hearsay Culture that we've discussed almost since the beginning. Although in 2006, people were still saying, what's this Facebook thing and why does it matter? You point out in your piece, very importantly, right, that social media, your view is, compounds the challenge because you see lots of violent and frankly, unhinged rhetoric online that could, you suggest, right, cause people to easily, quote, conclude that many of their peers hold hostile or even violent sentiments towards them and become fearful to attend classes or leave the dormitories. And you've alluded to this fear, and we're seeing it happen not just on college campuses, but also in high schools where protests are happening and so forth. But I want to come to social media and ask you a related point, because even if one agrees, which I think I do, with regard to that critique, there's another social media issue which I think exacerbates things, and that's the echo chamber. Social media, aside from being a source of disinformation, is also a place that has been shown, right? It's places where people go to hear, mostly in many instances, voices that agree with them. And so there isn't a lot of that free and open debate. Facebook has had a hard time maintaining it. Of course, Twitter, now known as X, at one point was doing that. And now I don't want to spend the rest of the show talking about Elon Musk and Twitter, but suffice to say, things may have changed there. But in terms of both the intolerance or unwillingness of many to hear divergent viewpoints, but also, right, the inability, almost, it seems, to have the kinds of open debate and discussions, or at least the challenges that seem to be growing, not diminishing, in these eras, to debate these issues. How much of that blame or concern do you put at the feet of social media?
Well, I think there's a tendency in society to take any problem that's cropped up since, when did Facebook start, 2005 or something, and say, well, it's because of social media,
Right.
the bad weather or whatever. So I don't want to do that.
No.
That said, um, the as you said, people mostly interact with their own kind of ideological bubbles on social media, and there's a phenomenon, of course, where if you're in a group where group dynamics tend to reward the individuals who are most outlandish and will say the most things that will resonate with the group, and they get them status within that group. So that's why you'll see more escalating rhetoric within a social media group, because those individuals will want to show that, well, I'm the most committed to this cause. I'm the most, pro-Palestinian person that there is, and therefore I'm going to say the most outrageous things against the Zionists, the Israelis, the Jews, and so on. And so, I think that's the reason you see a lot of this bad rhetoric. Sorry.
Mhm.
I did not silence my phone before this, and
No,
apologize.
no
Uh,
worries, and I can edit that out for air.
It's
So
probably not the first time this has happened on
no,
Hearsay,
it's not. It's not.
but I'm now turning my phone off.
Okay, very good.
Um, so, um, yeah, let's see, where was I? So,
You're talking about the just to pick it up, and I
right.
can.
So that,
Yeah.
yeah, so these group dynamics lead to this escalating, heightened rhetoric out there. I think, people look at social media, and then, they see hostile statements and rhetoric, and therefore they kind of assume that, that represents large swaths of people. And if they did, that's why you would feel so threatened. I mean, I do want to make sure that the listeners understand that there indeed have been violent incidents and there have been vicious threats. So I'm not saying that all the concerns of Jewish students are unfounded. I just feel like they maybe have been inflated beyond what they really were. But I don't want to discount that some people actually have been physically threatened or prevented from going to classes or been confronted. But I will say that the university policies have the means to address that, because harassment against individuals um, is an exception to the First Amendment. And so you cannot use speech that directly creates a harassing situation to an individual, but that's usually some form of speech combined with conduct, not just pure speech out in the open.
So let's use a specific example. I think it's valuable here. The phrase "from the river to the sea," right? The phrase has a history, a recent history of being used by terrorist organizations opposed to the existence of Israel, right? Suggesting that from the river to sea means that there will be no Israel. And by definition, therefore, the assumption is no Jews, at least in those areas, and they are gone in some way or another. Now it's an exception, but I have seen that phrase, although not nearly as prevalently. I have seen a phrase used by pro-Israel demonstrators occasionally to suggest, well, it's going to be Israel as opposed to Palestine, which could suggest violence the other direction. But the point is, the phrase itself is ambiguous in the sense that others who are using the phrase recently have argued that, well, they don't mean it to mean kill Jews or there's no Israel, but rather that there will be a Palestinian state. What we understand as a policy perspective is the quote two-state solution. The point being not whether Israel should exist, as you pointed out, but that the phrase itself is ambiguous, right? And so some could legitimately see that as threatening violence, right? i.e., it means kill Jews. Others could say, no, I don't mean that at all. I simply mean the two-state solution is kind of the polls. And of course, there is no clear accepted definition, although historically it has meant the non-existence of Israel. How should universities, in your view, deal with ambiguous speech, right? Because for reasons we mentioned.
Yeah, well, some interesting principles is a great example. I will say that I don't think you can properly say from the river to the sea is consistent with two-state solution, because from the river to the sea includes, what I would call 1948 Green Line Israel, not just the West Bank and Gaza, where the Palestinian state would be if you had a two-state solution. That would not be from the river to the sea. But
at least, and I'm not arguing that point, except to say that there are many, and I'm talking about students who have been quoted saying, well, we don't mean no Israel or even kill Jews. We mean stop the war and let's go back to peace. I mean, again, putting aside whether that makes any sense, right? At least that's one perspective that many apparently of the people using that phrase have meant. But go on, yes.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of other phrases they could use if they thought about it for a bit. But even so, again, arguing for violent resistance against Israel is clearly protected First Amendment speech. I mean, First Amendment protects everything up to direct incitement of imminent violence. And, that's not what these students are calling for. Globalize the Intifada, to me, gets a little bit closer because it's talking about, let's have violent resistance, not only in Israel where the occupation is taking place and so on, but let's have violence all around the world to try to stop this, this Israeli state, including here in America. So, but again, I don't think the Supreme Court would find that the chanting of these statements is trying to get people, incite individuals on campus to, engage in violence against Jewish people. A couple of people have, but I think these phrases are, protected free speech. The whole idea is we wouldn't need a First Amendment to protect speech that everybody agreed with or liked or found pleasant. That's, so we have to tolerate some unpleasant, vile speech. And, I think the thing to do is I support the counter protesters to come out and try to explain the alternative viewpoint and why Israel deserves to exist and so on. And that's how we deal with things, and we ought to deal with them on a campus, of course, which, campuses ought to be where simplicity goes to die. This issue hasn't been going on for 75 years because it's an easy dispute that is so clear what the solution is, any idiot could know it. The reason it's been lasted so long is because there are really hard truths that back both sides, and it's very difficult to come up with a solution that respects both of them in a way that their populations will be happy with. And those are the discussions we ought to be having on campus. And if this hard, really unpleasant 6 months is what we need to do to actually start doing that, maybe it will have been worth the terrible experience. We'll just have to see how this plays out.
I may be using your phrase, campuses are where simplicity should go to die later on in my teaching, David. And as a copyright lawyer and scholar, I'll make sure to cite you because that's at the core, right? I mean, that's at the core of why this is a challenging issue because to many, and particularly the protesters, there is a clear right, which is not the viewpoint of others. Let's talk in the remaining about 15 minutes or so that we have about some of your solutions. Because like I said, I think you laid out the problem well, and then I summarized some of those solutions. Let's dig in, right? So let's talk about those time, place, and manner policies. We've seen evidence in some of the protests, and you alluded to it, of violence. We've also seen there's some video evidence of law enforcement or campus security being injured by protesters, at least in one instance, who were violently entering a building. But again, right, you said free speech principles require that universities designate spaces and times where protests may continue. Spaces and times. So what does that look like? I mean, in your view, what are those? And I alluded to spaces before. You mentioned, okay, the classrooms, right, are places of free and open inquiry. But what do those spaces and times look like?
Yeah. I think that's going to vary a lot for different campuses, and we're going to have different viewpoints and opinions. These are line drawing exercises that are difficult, but in a general way, and again, sometimes you can't distinguish between, more public areas of universities and the places that are more residential. But I would say, keeping these protests away from dormitories by and large. Protests have to be confined. They can't block walkways so that students can't get from one part of campus to another. Students should be able to get to a dining hall without having to cross a picket line, essentially, and having to go through a wave of hostile protesters waving Palestinian flags and so on. I think that those would be very basic kind of guidelines. When I'm thinking about, my campus and, like classic areas in front of administrative buildings are, noteworthy places of protest. The campus green, essentially, where as long as you're not blocking anybody in the walkways and so on, that ought to be a place where, you can have a protest. I think campuses, the students have to sleep. I mean, they don't like to sleep sometimes, or they don't go to sleep till sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning. But you shouldn't have, when they talk about time, you shouldn't have to have the drum beat and the drums coming from these protests and from the river to the sea, a constant, non-ending noise that, makes it especially as you get into exam period and so on. First and foremost, these are places where students are supposed to be able to study. They live, they eat there, they sleep there, and those functions should be able to go on without like a constant bombardment of protests. How long the protest should be allowed to go on. And then you get into this point of these permanent encampments and so on. And I think then you're getting closer and closer to areas where, yeah, the university has some legitimate reasons why they don't necessarily have to tolerate students living on the campus green with tents and food service. I don't know, what they were doing about other bodily functions and so on, right in the middle of campus for, months at a time during exam period, during graduation. I think at some point, the university can say, listen, we need to take this space back. You can have it back later on, maybe after graduation, but we're not going to allow a permanent encampment go on in perpetuity in this space. Yeah.
We're chatting with David Schanzer of Duke University, author of the piece in his Substack newsletter, Perilous Times. Universities must tolerate anti-Israel protests, but regulate them to protect Jewish students. It was published on April 27th. So you alluded to We alluded earlier to the use of police, and I want to come back to that because we've seen very, prominent examples of that, and immediate criticism around it. You say, don't call the police in as in the first instance, but you don't say don't call the police in at all. So, at what point is that right? And the reason I ask that question is it's always easy to second guess universities, right? And I can imagine university, president saying very clearly, well, okay, should I wait until someone's killed, someone seriously injured before calling in the police? In other words, there may not be a perfect time. But right, you point out that calling in the case of Columbia's decision to call in the police to break up an unauthorized protest and arrest over 100 students was a quote big mistake. So let's talk a little bit about you talked about what that mistake is. So what should the standard be for when the police come onto a college campus?
Well, I would look at two things. I would say, first of all, universities have a lot of other tools at their disposal to discipline students. So why do we have to go to an arrest for violation of kind of civil law out or criminal law from an outside entity here in New York City or the city of Durham with the case with respect to Duke and so on. And those are, student conduct regulations. I mean, the university orders you to do something, you need to do it, or you can suffer the consequences. And those are laid out in the student manual, and there's all kinds of due process and hearings, and there's, why are you going to abandon for this issue alone the normal student conduct process? There's no justification for doing that. Second of all, I would weigh the extent to which the valid interests of the university of having a campus that functions, that's able to have its administrative, its teaching, its residential function go unimpeded. And if the speech and the protests are really not creating that much of a burden, then I think there's a lot less of a reason that you need to call in the police. If you have an encampment, and I think this seems to be what was happening at UCLA, where you literally have barricades being constructed, then you have a counter protest and you need to deploy large amounts of law enforcement to keep the counter protest from getting into a conflict with the protesters. And indeed, violence did break out. Well, I think now you don't have an orderly campus, you have a melee that is going on, and that would certainly justify, calling out law enforcement. And the areas in between, of course, are going to be a line drawing exercise. But I just think the campuses that have seemed to, many of them have dealt with this, I think, a lot better in the last couple of weeks, and they've been patient. They've talked to the students. They have issued suspensions, the kinds of things, this is not an insignificant thing to be both suspended from school and maybe even expelled for consistent violation of university policy. I mean, this is the meal ticket for many of these students for their entire future. So those are not insignificant penalties, and I would certainly try to use those before arresting. And then I want to make 2 points about the police tactics and protester tactics. Um, uh, you know, these aren't easy issues for the police, and indeed they seem to be maybe a little bit out of practice in terms of how to manage a one of these and to try to disrupt this without having it break into violence. And there have been certainly examples of police, using too much force that was appropriate again for breaking up what was more or less peaceful protests. But I've also seen a lot of student resistance that, anytime somebody got pulled out of the line, students pushing the police and hitting them to try to, bring their colleague back inside the encampment. And, that is absolutely prohibited. And once you do that, it's going to lead to an escalation and the use of more severe law enforcement tactics. So I don't think the protesters have been pure in this regard. And I also want to put in this whole issue relating to the masking, which to me is And it's very interesting, you've done some work at Elon. So being in North Carolina, we have a mask and protest law from back in the Klan days that is still on the books that makes it illegal to have these public gatherings with masks on, because that was an issue to fight against the Klan.
Right.
Um, and it seems to me the notion of civil disobedience and nonviolent protests, which the protesters purport to be engaged in, is undercut by the mask wearing.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King never told his people who were fighting against segregation to hide their identity, so they suffered no consequences from their civil disobedience. The whole idea of the civil disobedience is that you're willing to take the punishment,
Right.
to show how valid your cause is and how unjust the laws are that are being enforced against you, and you should do that openly and willingly. And so I think the protesters are trying to have it both ways. They want to say they're engaged in nonviolent protests and they believe in everything that they're doing, but they want to mask themselves so they don't suffer the consequences either from university discipline or from their fellow students who might take action against them, like doxing them on social media. And I think that is a very troublesome aspect of the protests that we've been seeing.
Well, and of course, the protesters also might argue, and this is true as well, is that sometimes you do have to push the envelope in order to get attention. I mean, we're recording in mid-May, and it does seem like the Biden administration has reacted at least to some degree to the protest, although it's hard to say, right? The students protesting are not the only people that are have been opposed to Israel's or the U.S. policy of arming Israel, and yet, at least as of right now, new limitations might be placed. And when you look at these protests and crossing those lines, right, protesters might say, look, we had to push the envelope. I mean, even get violent, a few might say, in order to get attention. Now, that's a time immemorial way of protesting, and it's not protected. And then you've got other scenarios like the one that was very well covered, where a protester spoke at the home of Dean Chemerinsky, right? After at a graduation event, and which is not a very interesting legal question whether you have a right of free speech in someone's private home, and the answer is no. But the point is that it got attention, right? Protesting, driving attention, right, is part of it too, and that's part of the challenge of how we regulate protests, in the sense that maybe standing in front of a dorm, as reprehensible as it would be, will get attention. And though the universities struggle with that issue as well. Let me close, David, with what I think was a very important and candid recognition and admission in your piece. You wrote towards the end of the piece. It's the the fourth to last paragraph. You wrote, "I know my position on this issue won't sit well with many Jews who are very disturbed by growing anti-Semitism and so forth." And I've discussed those issues with a few other guests, most recently with Megan Squire, who writes about hate speech online and studies it as a data scientist. But what I want to ask you about is something which I think is very important and often lost in these discussions. You wrote, "In my view, college is exactly where Jewish students should be starting to think about these issues and learning how to grapple with anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and anti-Israel ideas. The point being," and you close the paragraph by saying, "we send our kids to college to get ready to enter the world as it is, not the world we wish it to be." And so, in other words, you make a full-throated argument for not only Jewish students, but perhaps everyone who's dealing with different viewpoints, to not turn away from them, but, as you alluded to earlier, to face them, and that college campuses are the place where that should be happening. And so I share that view, but I also recognize the challenges, and I want to ask you the question from this perspective, right? Is it fair and going back to universities, for universities to be taking the position that, yes, but we want to make sure that everyone feels safe, and that students therefore who feel like they can't be there, or they're going to stay home, or they're not going to, which is the real issue, right, that colleges might be facing, right, not going to go to this school, right, are a concern of ours also. And so going back to how universities should react if admissions, right, literally, and maybe Columbia doesn't have to worry about this that much, but certainly schools that frankly don't have the kind of demand that top universities do might say, you know what, we got to draw the lines, or people may not be coming, or at least people may not be coming in the numbers we want. Is that a legitimate concern for universities in light of all of the moving parts here, and in light of all the challenges?
Listen, students and the parents that send their kids to these places, you know, certainly have a right to believe that their physical beings are going to be protected and safe. And so there's absolute power, and they should be uh, regulating violence, violent threats, and so on. But by and large, that's not really what we're talking about here. Um, we're talking about people who conflate the notion of safety with the notion of feeling uncomfortable with the ideas that are being expressed very vociferously on campus and the newspaper, and so on. And, I just think that uh, the idea that we should turn our campuses into these, vanilla places where nothing is ever said that makes somebody feel uncomfortable, that ideas, for example, we had a speaker who had used the blood libel against Jews in some of his poetry, was invited to campus. And, some of the students on campus said, well, this makes me feel unsafe because here we have an anti-Semite coming to campus. And, I just don't think that's true. It's despicable, but I'd much rather have the students trying to explain and learning and getting these tools of resiliency to engage with the broader community who's not going to be very sympathetic to this particular speaker, to explain what the blood libel is and why it is felt that that is such a horrible thing for people to be saying about Jewish people, and how they are personally affected when other people do that. And I think if they have that experience and they build those tools, well, then they'll be better prepared to enter the world where people do believe these things. We shouldn't
Let me
this.
push back though. I'm going to push back a little, because I can imagine, particularly parents of college students hearing this and saying, "Yeah, that's great, Professor Schanzer, right? Because you're a Duke and you can stay in your office. But if I'm going to send my," and by the way, again, I want to be clear. Right now, we're talking about Jewish students, but it could be any student, right? There could be, I mean, who knows? There could
And
be
it's been
protests.
often said by Black students and transgender students that when they hear these things, that they feel threatened and unsafe, and it defeats my identity. I can't concentrate on my work, and so on. So
And so
real.
yeah, right. And so I can imagine parents saying, at the end of the day, I want my kid to be safe. I want my kid to feel safe. And so your idealistic concerns, Professor Schanzer, about the nature of university should really give way to the fact that at the end of the day, phraseology which suggests violence could lead to violence.
Well, I guess my response is, well, what about, we just had graduation last Saturday. What about Sunday? you know, we're here to prepare your students for Sunday, not for them to have this, live in this idealistic world where there's no bad people, there's no hate, there's no war, there's no ism, whether it be racism, sexism, homophobism, and so on. Those things do exist, and we should study them and learn how to combat them. And your students, your kids are, I would say to the parents, they're better able to grapple with this than you give them credit for. Stop raising their anxiety and tell them, hey, go about your business, keep your head down, study. If you don't like what's happening on campus, ignore them. And if you want to stand up for Israel, you want to stand up for Black Lives Matter, LG Pride Day, then go ahead and do that and do it vigorously. And the university needs to be out there protecting people's physical, real safety to do that, as well as the protesters who are expressing their views. That's my view.
Professor David Schanzer, author of the Perilous Times Substack piece, Universities Must Tolerate Anti-Israel Protests but Regulate Them to Protect Jewish Students. Highly recommended. Thank you, David, for being on Hearsay Culture today to discuss these important issues.
Well, it's great to have a chance to deal with these things in such depth and to have a great conversation with you. So I thank you.
Thank you for listening to Hearsay Culture today in KZSU. Please check out hearsayculture.com for the Hearsay Culture Network's new shows and more content. But meanwhile, stay tuned for KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.